Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Dana Slamp. Dana is the founder of Prema Yoga Therapeutics, an IAYT member school and the leading training facility for yoga therapists in NYC. She leads advanced teacher trainings at Pure Yoga in Uptown New York, Yoga Vita in downtown New York, Three Sisters Yoga in Portland, Oregon, and the upcoming Ayurvedic yoga training at Pure Yoga July 13th through the 31st, 2016. Dana's presented at Columbia Medical University, the Telluride Yoga Festival, and several times at the Yoga Journal Conference. Dana's unique upbringing in a family of ministers and teachers led to a lifelong pursuit of spiritual truth, first in the arts through classical acting and writing, through her legal writing as paralegal, and through the teachings of yoga over the past 2 decades. Prema Yoga Therapeutics training for yoga teachers and medical healthcare professionals can be found at premayoga.org. And for a list of local classes as well as national courses and international retreats, you can check out her personal teaching site at danaslamp.com. So hello, Dana. Thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
Thank you. I'm well. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny talking to you on Skype because we actually both live in New York City, but you're presently in Washington State, right? Which is actually my home state.
Right. I'm right on the edge of Portland, looking into leading another training out here. But really why I'm here is to see my nephews.
Oh, excellent. Your family lives out there?
Yes. My brother and sister-in-law here with their kids. And then my mother and father also retired in the area just outside of Portland. So I get the best of 2 states out here for at least a week.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's beautiful there in the summer, no?
Oh, it's the most beautiful place on earth.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like London, whereas it rains all the time. So when it stops raining, it's so immaculately clean and shiny and glorious.
Yeah.
But try it in January and you might feel differently.
Yeah, it can be a little dreary. I definitely know that. There's a lot of seasonal affective disorder where I'm from.
True that.
Yeah. So talking about your family and where you're from, I wanted to first get started in just sort of exploring your story, and we're going to have a wide-ranging discussion about all things yoga therapy today, but I wanted to start kind of by asking you about your own personal story, what led you to the practice of yoga, and then maybe, write that narrative for us in relation to what specifically led you into then yoga therapy and the kind of deep and wonderful work that you're doing, creating programs, very rigorous programs for yoga teachers in yoga therapeutics.
Sure, absolutely. I think as a teacher, Jacob, you're always your first student.
Right.
So these kinds of stories are always origin stories. Mm-hmm. And we can get really woo-woo and say that in the theory of karma, that one chooses their parents. Mm-hmm. So the story really begins with us choosing the family that we're born in, which is a beautiful story. I mean, it's a beautiful origin story. And in my case, having that perspective has allowed me to appreciate my origins even more. I was raised in this very conservative Christian church, mm-hmm. and my father was from a long line of ministers. My maternal grandfather was a missionary in Alaska, and my uncles were in this family business, so to speak, as well. And then everybody else is a teacher. Mm. So there was this, I was raised in this family that cared very much about learning, cared very much about spiritual pursuits, but also cared a lot about community and about the arts. I was taught very early on to play the piano and to sing. And when I finally discovered acting, I was reluctantly encouraged to do that as well. Mm. Yeah. And then you know how it is. I mean, you want to act, it's over. The rest of my college and grad school was all about proving that I could do anything, and therefore I was going to choose to be an actor. Yeah. So I did that, but at some point in college, I was diagnosed with this tumor. Wow. In my pituitary gland.
What?
Yeah, and this was long before I had discovered yoga. So all I had really at my hands in terms of techniques were some that were very esoteric, like prayer, very valuable, but not so tactile, mm-hmm. and then Western medicine. And it wasn't cancer. It was a type of organic tumor that just really messed up my endocrine system.
Yeah.
So I had to be put on a daily regimen of drugs and go in for these MRIs. And it was sort of scary because, as you know, the pituitary gland is the hanging down thing of the brain.
Right.
You know, it's right in the center of your skull.
Yeah.
And it had so much to do with my relationship to myself, to be sick when I was in college, and also my relationship to being a woman. You know, this is the endocrine system after all. So after 3 years of taking these drugs, and being sort of finally coming to terms with the idea that it was never going to go away, I opted for surgery. And the surgery was pretty cool. I mean, it's brain surgery. They go in through the dura. But it wasn't like I had to get my head shaved or anything. It was just it was a pretty progressive and successful surgery for its time. And this was all happening when I was like 23.
Wow.
You know. And I think even though, it's probably the most Western thing you could do, there was a consciousness about it for me that I knew it was going to take a month of recuperation, and I was going to take that time to get my health in order and to start to change my diet a little bit. You know, there was a creeping sort of consciousness in how I needed to take some authorship in my own health. But it was still predominantly a victimization or in reaction to this thing that had happened to me. You know, this thing that had happened to me was kind of outside of myself, and I was managing that. So anyway, the surgery was more or less successful. And I went into a life. I went to grad school for classical acting and got pretty lucky, and was actually on a national tour when the symptoms came up again.
The same symptoms that you had prior to the surgery?
Yes.
Wow.
But in smaller form, much, much smaller form. So back to the endocrinologist, back to the experts, back to the MRI. And the good news was that the drugs had become a lot more easy to manage. You didn't have to take as many of them. It was a different type of drug, and it didn't have the same side effects, which were morning sickness. I mean, I was sick every morning of my grad school experience. So I started on the drugs, and this kind of like regulated the side effects, but then I started to get curious about whether or not I really needed these drugs. And I found a really wonderful kind of laissez-faire endocrinologist who understood that this was not a life-threatening thing and that I could participate a little bit and help self-regulate. And so we played with going off the drugs for a while, and it didn't really succeed. The same symptoms came back. But then ultimately, over a period of a little bit of time, I'd say about 2 years, and this was a time when I was doing yoga, I noticed that when I was in a meditation sadhana, my symptoms would stop. And my system would regulate. So I became very curious.
Yeah.
Also, it was just sort of like a plant, this whole pituitary thing. Yeah. Because as you know, the pituitary it has this place of reverence.
Right. Well, this is what I was going to ask. I was going to say, you know, at this time, did you realize how auspicious it was to have this kind of, illness being associated with something that is, in the Kundalini awakening language is often referred to as the site of the seventh chakra and the seat of enlightenment. So very interesting. Yeah. Interesting that you had this, illness that rested essentially in this place that's so auspicious.
In the seat of one's intuition.
Yeah.
Right. In the seat of one's connectivity. Different schools will associate it with sixth chakra, intuition and high reasoning, or with seventh chakra,
right.
Which I'm sure you and I would be comfortable saying would be a connection to the universe or to a God consciousness. But if the language is different, this could be a connection to ecology, to humanity, or to one's higher purpose or dharma, how you're going to leave the world. So, yes, it occurred to me many times over in my yoga studies, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Kundalini yoga therapy plays into my own education.
Oh, I was just going to ask, actually, I wanted to go back a little bit and ask specifically about how this experience with, a very conservative form of Christianity played into your relationship with divinity. I'm asking because I'm curious, because for me personally, I also had a very similar sort of background. I mean, I didn't have a family member who was a pastor, but I was raised in a very religious, a very Lutheran, conservative Lutheran family. And for me, I kind of lost all sense of divinity because that idea of God had become so contracted, had become so narrowly defined. And for me, some of my own awakening and healing was really opening up again to what divinity could be, which of course started in my yoga philosophy studies. So I'm curious, sort of that aspect of the story. How was your experience of God affected, and how did it change by the juncture between your Christian upbringing and your yoga experience?
Right. Well, I passed through I think one of the things that helped was I passed through the rubric of the arts first, which is another way of feeling one's spirituality.
Right.
And I think people like you and I don't know, maybe this is too self-congratulatory, but I think we're very, very important right now because the world politically and socio-politically is very bifurcated into conservative and moderate. And when I think of conservative spirituality or conservative religions, I think of them as the narrow path. And Krishnamurti had this beautiful, beautiful quote about spirituality. And, he kind of left the conservative Indian spirituality at the time, or the organizations that he was groomed into being in, to say things like this, which is, there are many paths to truth, but truth is a pathless land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And far too often in my tradition of birth, the means to truth were mistaken as the truth.
Yes.
And this can lead to a lot of pain. Mm-hmm. The literal reading of the scriptures can be very, very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And from the outside, you and I might identify now as liberals or moderates. From the outside, we know that some of our friends and colleagues perceive the narrow paths of the religions as being rather evil, which I think is unfortunate, because in those narrow paths, there are so many true believers. There are so many truly righteous men and women. And if you ask me to look inside my crystal ball, which, don't worry, that doesn't exist in yoga, but if we had one, I would say that what's next for the conservative Christian religions, I hope, is a return to mysticism.
Yes, yeah.
Is a return to using both sides of the brain, not just the part that likes things quantitative and literal, which can actually be based on fear.
Right.
But that is open. This is, in my lineage, is one of the greatest love teachers that ever walked the earth. This Christ-like way of looking at the world. And when you start to see the way that my career has panned out, I've been pretty conscious about integrating in love-based teachings into the business while still remaining true to the evidence-based side of our trainings and remaining true to the philosophies of yoga. So as we go through, I'll try to point out, and I'm sure you'll even see where it crops up.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's get into that then. So,
Okay.
because I think that one of the things that is really wonderful about the work that you're doing is that you really are integrating well the Eastern philosophies with the Western medical developments, but then you also have criticisms of a sort of purely or reductive Western way of approaching medicine or healing. So let's go to the philosophy of healing first and talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
And why an integrated approach might be so important based on this idea or this philosophy of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing is in yoga a lot in America, we talk about the mind-body connection. And this is a bit of a misnomer, Jacob, because the mind and the body are not really ever separate in the philosophies of yoga and Ayurveda.
Right.
If I ask you to define yoga, what would you say? What's probably one of the first words that would come to your head?
Oh, the most popular word is probably union.
Right. Right. So we could say union of the body and mind. We could say union of the left and right side of the brains. We could say union with that large connectivity. But in the West, we've really been dominated by this Cartesian view of the self, which is, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a little tricky. I mean, it's allowed us to make massive inroads in our knowledge base. But the downside of that is it's saying that our existence depends on our thoughts.
Totally. Which
is extremely traumatic. If you're coming out of a trauma or you're suffering with anxiety, depression, mixed anxiety and depression, if you have a mental disorder, to say that your existence depends on thoughts, or worse, that your identity is defined by your thoughts, can be incredibly crippling.
Yeah.
But in Samkhya philosophy, which is the main philosophy that grew up alongside yoga and Ayurveda, it says that we are the Atman. And the Atman, you could probably say it better than I can, Jacob, but just for the sake of this conversation, I would call it the soul.
Right.
And that the soul came from the whole. It came from that grand collective consciousness, that grand universal organization. And we have an ego when we pass through into this life, when the soul meets body, according to this philosophy. But the ego isn't so evil as it is in the Freudian or the modern pop psychology sense of the word.
Right.
It's an entirely other thing. It's the ahamkara, right? And the ahamkara is like the conditions of your birth. It's your last name, it's your gender, it's stuff like that. But it's not you.
Right.
You are Sat. You are Sat Chitananda. So Sat, the compound Sanskrit term, Sat meaning truth and Chit meaning consciousness. Okay, so our thoughts are in there, but also Ananda, which is a bliss. It's the totality of bliss. So in yoga therapy, whether someone is managing a body imbalance or a mind imbalance, the return in the embodied philosophy is the same. Because if we say that you are not your thoughts, then you're not your emotions.
Right.
And you're not your pain. You're not your pain either, because pain is output from the brain. So there's many different types of pain. What we usually think of as pain is nociceptive pain. Like if I pinched you, you would feel a sensation, right? The tissues send information to the central nervous system, wings up to the brain, and the brain sends back pain to the tissues. But in the case of certain traumas or chronic pain, you're still feeling that pain, and there is nothing wrong with the tissues. This happens all the time in yoga therapy. People show up and they say, the doctor says, it's all in my head. Well, in a way, that's true. It is all in your head because pain is a function of your brain. But it's not true because you didn't make it up. I see you. You're in pain. I hear you. Let's see if we can find another way of you showing up that isn't painful. And this is where mindfulness, any type of mindfulness, any type of breath work can be deeply valuable, to find the space between the pain, to identify to something else, to find a part of the body that is not in pain, to circumnavigate this synaptic pattern, which in our philosophy is to say a samskara, right? A thought pattern, to circumnavigate that and to find another way of being. But you see, if it really is a body injury, the yoga therapy is also very similar, right? Because if you're not your body, then you're not your disease. And if you're not your body, you're not your injury. You have a bum knee, you're not your bum knee. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but people come in with huge stories about their bum knee. Oh, I'm getting old. Oh, it's my fault. Oh, it's my behavior's fault. It's my job's fault. Well, actually, you just have a bum knee.
Right.
Get a diagnosis. Let's see if we can move it. Let's see if we can move the synovial fluid and the tissue and everything we would do in a healthy perspective. But anyway,
well, it seems like, I
think the first take on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that seems to be what you're saying is really great, because it feels especially prevalent in the case of, psychological illness, where someone can have, depressed states of mind or anxious states of mind, and the sort of status quo looking at it, in the way that you're saying, this Cartesian mindset is to think, I am a depressed person. It's a form of identification where part of the complex is that I only know myself to be that depressed person. I have somehow become invested in my identity as being depressed. Therefore, part of the suffering is the suffering of losing that identity almost. So it's sort of this double-edged sword where, on the one hand, it's this state, this persistent state of depression that is itself painful, and then compounded on that, the possibility of further suffering, because to leave it behind would be its own kind of suffering. Is that a little bit what we're
you
talking
nailed it
about?
on the head. Oh, absolutely. And I'm sure there's listeners that identify. And that was the second part of what intrigued me about yoga therapy, having suffered from anxiety and depression, and having had moments of grief that lasted way too long, and not being able to manage them completely with talk therapy.
Right.
But finding that the yoga was an amazing complement to talk therapy.
And what do you think what is talk therapy? And this, of course, is generalization. I'm sure there are some mindful-based talk therapy practitioners out there, but in general, if we were to generalize, what would talk therapy be missing in this kind of in this whole sort of holistic healing approach that we're looking at?
Right. I can only speak personally and as a yoga teacher and therapist, since I'm not a licensed, therapist. I should really disclose that. But when I see our licensed social workers and talk therapists come in and learn the techniques and bring them back into their practices, usually what they bring back first are the down-regulating techniques.
Yeah.
So the down-regulating techniques are pranayama, meditation, yoga nidra, withdrawal from the senses, and certain types of asana. Sometimes restorative, but that does not always work with anxiety or grief. Sometimes yin, and sometimes a mindful Deshakachar-based slow flow. So just on my way here, just a little bit of yoga history. Krishnamacharya is the father of modern yoga, and to talk about how yoga therapy and modern yoga differentiate, we should say that for the most part in Krishnamacharya's career, he practiced yoga therapy, which is to say one-on-one yoga, not group yoga. Do you mind if I get into that?
Oh, please get into that. But first,
cool.
I just want you to explain what down-regulating means for anybody that
there
that doesn't know what that means.
Okay, great. So just a little primer on the nervous system, since nothing's really changed since the beginning of time in the human nervous system. We're very adaptable, but in regards to our nervous system, we're not. we're really set up for two sides of our autonomic nervous system to be moving in duality. One is always winning. One side is the SNS response, the sympathetic nervous response, and that's the fight or flight response, which worked really great on the savannah, right?
Yeah.
If you and I were out picking berries and we heard a rustle in the bushes, we would need that response.
Yeah.
What happens, right? In the sympathetic nervous system response, we take a little bit of air, we're holding it in our upper chest, our eyes, right, widen. Physiologically, our immune system stops, right? There's no energy to the immune system, which right there, that should be a big ding, 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 a big indication of how yoga could help with the healing process. The fertility system, it's not working. Digestive system, not working. And that's another big bell of how we need to downregulate out of this SNS. In Ayurveda, they say that all disease stems from the digestive system.
Oh, really?
So anyway, back to the savannah. Yeah, it all comes from the gut.
Wow.
Bold, right?
Yeah,
the bold
well, I mean,
statement.
it definitely says that we should be careful what we're eating, right?
Well, when modern science shows us that we have just as many neurons in our gut as we do in our brain,
Which
it's
is
important to
amazing.
start taking note. Yeah. The thing is, though, through the vagus nerve, that is a communication system that only goes up. So we can't say to our digestion, work better. Our only way in is the respiratory system, is the breath.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to the bushes, right? There's that rustle in the bushes. We're picking berries. We have our moment, right? We're ready to fight, to kill a gazelle if we eat meat, or to run from the lion. And then what do you know? It's a little bunny. So what do we do in our tribe? We laugh.
Yeah.
We laugh, which is the laughing helps bounce the diaphragm and it down regulates the nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve, which is sending 70% of its information up to the brain and very little information coming down, particularly from our cognitive mind, right? So cognitive therapy, sitting and talking and telling a story and repatterning your trauma has been found to not be enough necessarily. And that's where a lot, I mean, this is a broad thing, and I invite listeners to go and to research this on their own and to not take my word for it, but to start looking at the somatic psychology that's out there, how well they're using mindfulness and yoga to manage trauma and its side effects. It's really cool.
Wow, that's like, it's so fascinating with this explanation that you're giving of the directionality of, the two brains, essentially, the gut moving up and the brain moving down. And I don't think I've ever heard it expressed that way, and it really does kind of give so much legitimacy to practices of the breath based on what you're saying, rather than, thinking that you can kind of reformat the body just by thinking in a new way. Or that, that maybe chitta vritti, that this concept that we have where we're looking to cultivate new, essentially mental vibrations. We could
mental
think of,
patterns.
Yeah,
sure.
We can think of that in like mental patterns that are created via the breath, rather than thinking. I think traditionally we think of it just in something that happens in the brain, but there could be something that's sort of like reformatted through the breath, a chitta vritti that sort of is translated into the body through the breath. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just sort of something that I'm experimenting with in my mind at the moment. But what you're saying is really amazing.
Well, can I take it a little further,
Go for
Jacob?
it. Yeah.
Because this is one of the first paradigm shifts we want to see from our students, no matter where their profession takes them. If they're a social worker in a hospital, or whether they're just like, a yoga teacher working at the local gym, can you start to see the mind as something outside the brain?
Yeah.
And the first thing I ask them is, point to your mind, right? And it takes a moment. And then we point to our mind, and 8 out of 10 people are pointing at their brain.
Yeah.
But your brain is not your mind. And this is actually this is the pathless land of truth, Jacob, because you have your path and I have mine, but we've ended up at the same point of truth, that this is embodied philosophy. Mm-hmm. That the philosophies of yoga, that the psychology of yoga is in the body. Mm-hmm. We're not saying that say, Muladhara, the root chakra, really, really exists. Okay, that like you would cut open the body and find a chakra. We're saying that certain neural points, though, that were some of the first, this is the first place where the egg split into different parts, right? This is where it began. And we could relate it, let's say, to put it in Western thought, to the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
Right? That if these needs aren't cared for, other things will happen. And in the embodied philosophy and psychology of yoga theory and practice, your mind is not just your brain. Your mind is in your body.
Yeah.
And this is doubled down by innovative Western psychology. This is just straight up Bessel van der Kolk. The body keeps the score.
Yeah.
Right? And I hope it's encouraging to any movement person to know that if you do create a deeper diaphragmatic pattern of breath, that you are providing a down-regulating system for the central nervous system. So I think to go around, Jacob, I should go back to the other side of the coin, right? We talked about fight or flight. Mm-hmm. And so now we should talk about the other part of the nervous system, which we can call the rest, digest, and heal response of the nervous system. So in my early scenario, we're laughing. There was a bunny in the bushes, right? Mm-hmm. We're laughing. The diaphragm starts to down-regulate the vagus nerve. We let out the breath. We stop that breath pattern that the anxious person has of holding the breath high up in their chest, and we start to bring it down into our belly. Mm-hmm. And then things start to come back to homeostasis, and that is an act of down-regulating. Mm. So that happens naturally. And a lot of people benefit from it. I mean, a lot of people are really good under stress, and they sleep really well at night. But what hasn't changed is our body has not adapted to repetitive or chronic stress. We live in a world where there is always a rustling of bushes.
Yeah.
There's always a cell phone going off, right? There's always somebody advertising to us.
Yeah.
There's always a screen on. And this is not helping our nervous systems. This is not helping with trauma. It's not helping with getting us rest. Because remember, if you're in a state of chronic stress, your immune system is not functioning. It's not working at high functioning, nor is your digestive system. Mm. So yoga therapy has far-reaching effects for many imbalances. Fertility, too. Circulatory system. Can you get your heart rate up? Right? That's the big deal in health. Everybody wants to go to the gym. They want to get their heart rate up. Absolutely. You should do it. You should do exactly what they say to do, right? Which I think is like, oh man, I'd have to look at what the Heart Society says, but I think it's something like 2 hours of cardiovascular, an hour and a half, I think, a week. I don't have that in my notes, sorry. No, but are you able to turn your heart rate down? Mm. Or are you walking around this world with low levels of adrenaline and cortisol in your blood, which is precursor to many chronic diseases?
Wow.
People are having a hard time calming down. And when they don't calm down, they don't heal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of the therapists are bringing in those down-regulating techniques, those techniques that we've been given through yoga that can help calm the nervous system. Mm. Yeah.
That's incredible. So I wanted to ask, actually, this is sort of a tangential question, but I'm just curious, when you're talking about laughter as being a deregulating experience, is there any literature or research about the health effects of laughter? Is that something that you know anything about?
Oh, well, there is laughter yoga. I can't quote. I'm pretty sure there is. I'm pretty sure that there is. There are some studies. I think there was an anecdotal one where this guy was really sick and he just watched comedies all day. But I'm sure there's some better evidence out there than that. But also, Jacob, crying is also downregulating too. The diaphragm also bounces.
Yeah.
But if you're crying all the time, it just doesn't work.
Right.
Yeah.
Huh. So then back to, I remember before I interrupted you, asked you to go on the downregulating thread, you were going to talk a little bit about Krishnamacharya and his approach to yoga, and I think you had sort of a stream of thought that you wanted to go on.
Oh, sure. Well, there's a little bit of, there's a couple misnomers that happen when we bring yoga to the West, or not misnomers, I'll say miscommunications that I think need to be clarified. Let's say there's many different ways of categorizing yoga, but let's say that there's actually 3 types of yoga that's practiced in the West. The first is called Vyam, and Vyam it translates as exercise.
Okay.
It's yogic exercise, and this is what's predominantly taught in the West.
Right.
However, when you go through teacher training, the teacher trainings here in the West are very, very short, very short.
Yes.
They can be as short as 3 weeks, where Krishnamacharya studied for 7 years with his teacher in the foothills of the Himalayas. Plus he had however many degrees, I think 4 at least, maybe 6.
Yeah.
But anyway, after a month, you're taught how to lead a good yogic exercise class.
Yeah.
And usually the down-regulating aspect is there. Because remember, yoga is union. So I would argue if a class is only exercise, if it's only getting your heart rate up or building strength, but it doesn't bring your heart rate down in something like a shavasana, I would question whether you should call it yoga at all.
Right.
Okay? Just going to float that out there.
Yeah.
Consider it. Okay? Just at home, folks at home, think about it. Yeah, I want to make sure I don't get too preachy, because then I stop being a yoga teacher, right? Then the second type of yoga, and this might be the one that came here first, is Upasana. And Upasana is yoga for spiritual practice or discipline. So it could be a yoga for personal transformation. When it's in a daily practice, we call it a sadhana. And we have a lot to be grateful for here. Whether your path is to be an atheist and a yogi, or whether you have some spiritual language around your yoga practice, ultimately we can be grateful historically for the way that these techniques were preserved by those who felt very strongly about them because they were doing them for spiritual reasons, for Upasana. But, the stories are littered with people who did yoga for other reasons, too. You can do yoga for power.
Yeah.
But ultimately, in its whole form, we find that it usually leads back to a personal transformation. And a lot of people find this in exercise classes as well. And then the third type of yoga that you see here, that for some reason, I don't know, maybe because it can't be done all the time in a big general class, is yoga chikitsa. Chikitsa means medicine. It's yoga therapy. It's the precise application of yogic techniques for healing and disease management. And this is what Krishnamacharya predominantly taught.
Wow.
Yeah. Especially, I would encourage yoga aficionados and teachers to go back and to read the biographies. Read his son's biography, Deshkachar's biography, read the A.G. Mohan biography, and hear about the way he worked one-on-one with clients. Because this is our birthright, just as much as, say, the primary series is. And both should be celebrated and applied when needed the most. But because yoga is union, it's sometimes hard to tease one of these types of yoga out from the other because they can be intricately linked.
Right.
But I think what's important for us as teachers and for those that will be getting yoga therapy accreditation is that we're very clear about our intention, so that those that really need healing can seek us out.
So what we're looking to do is not necessarily to privilege one over any other, but rather to see these as kind of a three-pronged aspect of a more holistic practice. So on the one hand, we have our yoga exercise, we have our sadhana, and then we have, which, some people would, I suppose, consider their exercise part of their sadhana or a component of their sadhana. And then we have, this more prescribed, individualized practice that's more therapeutic. Is that kind of the idea, that all of these are working
Yes.
together? Mm-hmm.
In the yoga culture, yes.
Okay.
In the personal practice, I would hope that everything is yoga therapy in a way. That when you go for your exercise class, that you seek out a teacher that honors the downregulating effects of yoga, that understands that's an integral part of your practice, whether you're in the most challenging class or not. And you can find this. I mean, you can find hot power teachers that will still have the personal transformation and will have therapeutic effects according at least to season or time of day. Obviously, hot power isn't right for everybody, but it's still there. I would thread it through. But the word healing actually is our second point of potential confusion that I wanted to clarify. Because the definition of healing comes from an Old English base, how, which means whole. Healing is being whole. And in the West, when there were times of confusion and there were shysters, certain laws were made that false claims could not be made by healers. And this is very easy to follow in yoga. But for those of us that understand that a practice of union, well, isn't that being whole, right? Then our practice can be healing. It's not necessarily saying, in fact, it's not at all saying that we are making claims that we're healers, because we're not. And I'm not saying that according to Western law. I'm saying that according to yoga theory, philosophy, and practice. The ability to heal and to become whole is in your student. Always. So you never diagnose. And you never even treat. You don't even treat. If I could say you do anything, I would say you empower. You empower the body and mind to heal itself. And so that's something, that's kind of the legal side of things, but I think it's important to note that when we're teaching yoga or providing yoga therapy, that's all we're doing. We're not saying that we are the healers, because we're not, and we never have been. We're giving the student empowering techniques to take some authorship in their healing so that they're not in reaction like I was. Happened to them.
So that's very...
And if there was ever a time... Yes?
No, go ahead.
Well, if there was ever a time that the world needed it, it'd be now. Do you know that 3 out of every $4 spent in healthcare are spent on chronic diseases? Preventable chronic diseases. 1 in 2 Americans have a chronic disease. So that is a preventable disease that came about from their own actions. So it's really about what Ayurveda says, health depends most on what you do every day. How are you changing your actions to take some authorship in your health? It's never saying, I don't think any of these complementary or alternative medicines would say, don't go to your Western doctor. Go to your Western doctor. But on the other 364 days of the year, what are you doing to be a healthy person?
Well, and that seems to be what's sort of missing is that, it's, of course, the tide is changing, but I would definitely was raised in a family where it was like, you get ill, you get sick, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor was kind of like, it was like God, the doctors knew everything, and and that was the one-stop shop where you went, and there was no sort of eye toward any kind of embodied practices that you would do every day. There was no kind of, and that seems to be the issue, is that Western doctors, of course, we've gone, so the technology is incredible and they can do amazing things, but at the end of the day, they're technicians and they're specialists, but they're not necessarily giving us the tools to live preventatively. They're not. My brother has Crohn's disease, and no doctor ever talked to him about changing his diet. I mean, it's really bizarre.
I don't even know if there's a diet class in a lot of medical schools.
It's wild. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why the entire system's broken. That's why we're 39 in healthcare outcomes in terms of world cultures, world countries. But if we do our part, as individuals, then everything gets better.
Yeah.
And there's some amazing stories about where yoga and mindfulness have been integrated into medical communities with huge, amazing results. In fact, I just a dog-eared one I wanted to share with you. It also involved cognitive therapy too, interestingly enough. Let's see if I can get to it here. Sorry, bear with me if you're listening.
No worries.
Where are you? I love this study. Oh, here we go. Massachusetts General Hospital, Benson Henry Institute. Let's see, they had over 15,000 people participate, and it was it was over a decade. It was about, it was 8 years. It was over a period of 8 years. It was a mind-body intervention course or program, which combined meditation, mindfulness. It involves social support, which is something we do really well, I think, in the yoga community in general, as opposed to just going to a core class.
Yeah.
And then it also had cognitive therapy involved. And it was all there to cultivate the relaxation response, but also to cultivate resiliency in patients that were managing chronic diseases.
Yeah.
So after these people had been in the program, this is crazy, you have to look this up, the utilization at the hospital decreased for the people that were in the mind-body intervention, by 43%.
Whoa.
Yes.
Wow.
They went to the emergency department 1.7 times a year, as opposed to 3.6 times a year. And they went to the lab 43% less, and they had imaging, so any kind of radiology, 50.3% less.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a huge study. It's over a long period of time.
But aren't there financial, when I hear that, I think, because we have a profit-driven healthcare system, are there people who are losing money because these people aren't going as often? Or are we saving money?
Who you talk. Okay, I'll tell you who really likes these stats. Some of the insurance providers,
right?
The president of Aetna, the president of Aetna is a meditator, and he's done some, he's done some programs within his own business. I don't know if he's expanded those to his providers, or to his clients. I'm not sure. And hospitals love it. There was a study out. I wish I had this at my hands, but everybody has an encyclopedia in their pocket, so I trust you'll look it up if you can find it. But a neuroscientist emailed me once and said, "What is the deal with this study?" I'm paraphrasing, that says that if you do yoga and mindfulness and breathing exercises in the hospital, you're released a day earlier and use half the pain medications or something like that. So hospitals really like this data. Hospitals, insurance providers, Big pharma, not so much.
Right.
Although big pharma is very happy to put a picture of somebody doing tree pose on their ads to sell their antidepressant.
Yeah.
So they're very happy with stealing the images and the techniques of our culture in order to sell their own product.
Right.
But I'm not really sure if they're interested in how yoga helps. The U.S. is about 5% of the global population, but we use 75% of the global prescription of opiate consumption.
Wait, how much percent?
75.
75% of the opiates on Earth are consumed by 5% of the population?
Of the prescription opiates.
Oh my
yes.
gosh.
Yeah, and prescription drugs kill more people than illegal drugs. So it's there. I mean, please research it yourself. But I'm openly disclosing I take a prescription drug, but I take it less because I do my work.
Yeah.
I do my meditation, I do my yoga, and ultimately this one hopes will prevent me from getting a chronic disease.
Yeah.
So there are a lot in the medical community that love this work. There's great studies out of UCLA that yoga and mindfulness can increase the length of telomeres. Dean Ornish has showed like a reversal of the effects of heart disease in his mindful programs, which involve both diet and yoga, right? Everything Ayurveda should be seen as part of the whole, both individual and part of the whole. And our own faculty member, Dr. Lauren Fishman, has a great study out that was just in the Times about 5 months ago about a daily yoga practice, only about 15 minutes, reversing the effects of osteoporosis.
Wow.
So and it's going to be growing, we're never going to have the amount of money that pharmaceutical companies will have for research. But I think that this research is important for those who need to see the data. Although I really want to say almost in the same breath that yoga is individual and it's an experiential knowledge.
Right.
So I understand why some in the yoga community say this shouldn't be a medical protocol. Mm-hmm. I think with the data and with the research, we can start to have what I like to call yoga therapy guidelines.
Yeah. Okay,
so I know that these techniques work with this type of imbalance. I'll start there and I'll see what the individual client needs.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Yoga Alliance for a second, because there was a recent decision that was made by Yoga Alliance, and I know you had very strong opinions about it, where Yoga Alliance decided to take away, or rather said that they would no longer allow programs certified through Yoga Alliance to call themselves yoga therapy programs. So what was the incentive behind this? How did this happen? And what are the issues surrounding it?
Well, I think the issues are predominantly legal. Mm-hmm. There might be some other political undertones of it, but those aside, I think we should first address the legal issues.
Yeah.
So we talked about the nature of the word healing, and that at its root, it stems from becoming whole. Mm-hmm. Right? And we see that in the philosophies of yoga. But in the U.S., because of bad apples and a couple centuries of misleading people claiming to be the healers, not even saying that they're empowerers or healing or anything like that. But the word healing is pretty much owned by the Medical Care Act, at least in our state. And it's only for use by licensed medical health professionals. And that type of regulation is absolutely necessary, I think. I mean, in retrospect, if I could turn back time and, be an educator 120 years ago or even 80 years ago, I'd like to see the word healing being one that's given to the client or the patient. But that's not the case. That's not the way that the law is written. Also, I think that the Yoga Alliance thought that there would be some false claims out there. You know what I mean? That people would be saying that that they can do what they can't. And it's funny because the International Association of Yoga Therapists is pretty precise about this. And it's pretty clear, and it's actually become clearer, that yoga therapy is not going to treat or diagnose any more than dance therapy or music therapy would treat or diagnose, right? Mm-hmm. Or a massage therapist. And, that to me is common sense. But who knows? I think the Yoga Alliance was looking at a situation that was getting a little out of control.
Right.
So they made some sweeping choices without consulting their members, and asked that certain words be taken out of trainings. And asked that a disclaimer be posted if their name was used. And the argument there was that it was protecting the members of the Yoga Alliance and the yoga community in general. But if you read the disclaimer, it seems to be mostly protecting the Yoga Alliance. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the thing is, though, to be completely fair, to protect the Yoga Alliance is also to protect the Yoga Alliance members, which, remember, the Yoga Alliance has now become an industry standard, and there's plenty of people who have studied for 3 weeks or 1 month who can now call themselves yoga teachers. And the Yoga Alliance was trying to prevent, this broad use of certain terms that legally you can't use.
Right.
So I really respect that part of the decision very, very much. And I think it was something that probably needed to be done.
Yeah.
But there's other ways of going about this, Jacob. And there's many different ways that yoga therapy can continue its promulgation and its use without including those who are registered yoga teachers, which is to say they have paid to be on Yoga Alliance's list. Mm-hmm. And this is already happening on a broader scale. The U.S. Army hires yoga therapists.
Yeah.
So those yoga therapists that work at U.S. Army bases, that's what's on their tax return.
Wow. So
the U.S. government honors that as a profession. And if you look at the history of, say, homeopathy, okay, let's look at this separate complementary and alternative medicine of homeopathy. They chose not to be licensed or regulated by the government. Mm-hmm. And they're under the Medical Freedom Act. But the Medical Freedom Act is only in 11 states. So, in that profession, they really have to manage their language as well. Yeah. But this is all good. We should never have, like I say, the loss of the word healing is sort of unfortunate, but it's more of a philosophical loss. As long as we're empowering our students to take some agency in their healing, sure, there's going to be a group that will be called yoga teachers, and they will likely have less training, although there may be some that have extensive training in that group. And there's also going to be a group of yoga therapists, and that's going through a grandparenting process right now. Our grads are in the process of becoming certified yoga therapists with IAYT. And I think that I believe this deeply serves the public as well, because it can say, this person has studied for 2 years, has gone through, as opposed to like 2 months or a month, they've gone through a comprehensive training. They know how to integrate with licensed medical health care professionals. They know how to speak to your doctor. They know how to interpret what you tell us from your doctor. And they know how to modify. In my opinion, yoga therapy is preferring that PNS down-regulating technique aspect of yoga more often than, say, a general power class would. Mm-hmm. And it says that they have some experience with managing those who have a chronic illness or a disease, or they've worked with, say, a lot of times we get referrals from PTs that are like, look, the health insurance is done. This person needs to have, a continuing physical practice. What can you do? And I think when you say yoga therapy, I mean, these are just my subjective opinions. I think, too, you're saying that you're also bringing in the mind aspect. You'd be hard-pressed to find a yoga therapy program that doesn't involve meditation, yoga nidra, and mindfulness.
Right.
Now, both of these emerging professions organically come from the East, I believe, but are practically being honed to improve our communication. We're really only as good as our communication, right, Jacob?
Yeah.
And yoga, wherever you find it, and even if your teacher has just come out of school, there's great teachers that just come out of school. Yoga is still going to be a great form of exercise for you. Mm-hmm. But if there's an imbalance, if there's disease, if there's injury, if there's a mental imbalance, or if we need to work with licensed healthcare professionals, I think you're much better working one-on-one with a yoga therapist.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, it sounds like an exciting time for yoga therapy, and it sounds like a time really of evolution and really a clarifying of what sets apart a truly kind of well-trained and integrated yoga therapist practitioner versus somebody that might throw it around. And I think that you were right to mention that I think Yoga Alliance was responding to kind of a pervasive. I know that I've seen certain yoga teachers claim themselves to be yoga therapists, and I know for a fact that they haven't gone through any kind of rigorous training. And so I do think there has been a very loose throwing around of that word, which is perhaps problematic. And we don't want to, cheapen what that designation means. We want it to be something, rigorous and meaningful. So, thank you for going through that. So we're sort of ending near the end of our time, but we wanted to end on a story, which is the story of Vishvamitra. So do you want to take us on that little narrative journey?
I'd love to. Just thinking about what I'd like to talk to you about. And we did our stuff, right?
We touched on a lot.
Yeah. But I'm just really taken lately by this story of Vishvamitra. It came up actually in a sound therapy training because Vishvamitra discovered the Gayatri mantra at the moment of his epiphany at the end of the story. Huh. And you remember I said that a lot of people use the techniques of yoga historically for many different things. A lot of times they use it for power. And Vishvamitra began that way. He was a king, actually. And he was a pretty good king. But his area, his country, I guess we could say, his dominion, was suffering from a drought. And they had a really bad harvest one year. And Vishvamitra went into the forest. This is probably outside of Rishikesh. And he was with his men. He was with a small army. And they were looking for game, to feed the army. And they came across the cave of Vashista. Now, Vashista is a sage, and his title is Brahma Rishi. Brahma Rishi means a sage of the highest order. And Vashista was very inviting and welcoming to the king. He says, "Come, sit down." And Vishvamitra, the king, he said, "Oh no, we do not mean to disturb you, or we don't want to cause, undue strain on your household. We see you're just a rishi." And Vashista said, "No problem." And he called forth this cow, and it was this magical cow that provided this massive, massive feast for the army. So everyone sat down to eat. And of course, Vishvamitra, the king, is starting to hatch a little plan. So he sits next to Vashista, the sage, and says, "Listen, I love this cow. I understand that it's given to you," I'm paraphrasing, "through your powers. But wouldn't this cow better serve humanity if it were in the hands of a king? After all, we've had a terrible harvest. We're in a period of drought. I feel that you should be bestowing this cow to me for the good of the people, Sri Vashishta. Well, Vashishta wasn't going for it. He said, no, this type of power can only be held by those who have spiritual attainment. So Vishvamitra, the king, he ups the ante. He says, well, in a time like this, I can easily get an emergency mandate from the courts and I could seize your cow. And Vashishta says something along the lines of, go ahead and try. So the army starts to pursue, in the forest, they start to pursue this cow. And of course, they can't catch it. And they get more and more frustrated. They look like idiots in front of the king. So finally, the king says, catch the sage, catch Vashishta. But he would dematerialize in front of them, and they couldn't catch him either. So then the king got very angry and asked his bowmen to shoot arrows to kill Vashishta in order to seize the cow. He's in complete, let's say, sympathetic response. Yep. He's going in a battle. So the bowmen take aim, and they shoot at Vashishta. And Vashishta takes his staff, and he turns it, right? He turns it sideways, and the staff swallows up all the arrows. And Lord Vashishta says, is that enough, good king, or shall I swallow up your bowmen too? And of course, Vishvamitra is incensed, but he leaves the fight, and he goes home to the palace, and he understands that his power is meaningless. Right? It's really the spiritual guy. It's this Brahma Rishi that has the real power. Mm-hmm. And he decides, that is the power I'm going to pursue. So he leaves everything. He renunciates. He leaves his crown, he leaves his home, and he retreats up into the Himalayas himself to go into an intense period of sadhana. And it said he did pranayama. I'm sure he did some asana, but mostly to meditate. 1,000 years go by. And his meditation gets so adept that it starts to draw the energetic attention of Indra, the god of the celestials, the king of the celestials. Now, it's kind of funny because in these old stories, the gods are like not necessarily godly all the time. Like this Indra guy, he's kind of like the comptroller, He's just in like the organizational head of the cosmos. But he thinks that his power is going to be usurped. So what does he do? He sends a beautiful celestial woman to dance before Vashishta in his meditation. And it works. He comes out of his sadhana, he marries the woman, and they live in this connubial bliss for some time. Just totally chilling, full honeymoon period. In a lull, Vishvamitra remembers his meditations. And he kind of misses that feeling. He misses that calm. And he tells his partner, this beautiful woman, I'm going to go meditate for a while. And she immediately gets very suspicious because she works for Indra. What do you mean? Where are you going? Keeps pestering him until Vishvamitra gets a little suspicious and starts questioning her. Where exactly do you come from? Where did you grow up on the earth? Who's your parent? Until it escalates. He gets very suspicious. Who do you work for? This kind of thing. At which point she immediately disappears. Well, Vishvamitra thinks, I must have been tempted. I can't believe. He's just full of guilt for leaving his studies, and he goes back to meditation. And so Indra tries it again. But when he tries it again, Vishvamitra's onto him. A beautiful woman appears, and Vishvamitra uses his spiritual power in the story to turn her into a rock.
Oh, no.
But at this time, he's incredibly depleted and has to go into another intense sadhana in order to build up his spiritual power. So, in a nearby land, there was this other king, King Trashanku. And King Trashanku was getting pretty long in the tooth. He was getting really old. And it was his desire that he ascend to the heavens in his bodily form. So he had gone to Vishista. Remember him, the guy with the staff? Mm-hmm. Yoga practitioners, Vashistasana, that's the staff, right? That's the side plank. That's Vishista's staff we're making with our bodies there. So this other king, Trashanku, had gone to Vishista and asked him to help him ascend in bodily form. And Vishista said, absolutely not. This is against the divine law. I will not do it. So the old king is pretty pissed. But one day, someone comes into his court who says, actually, there's another sage who's very powerful, who's growing in great, great power. This guy, Vishvamitra. Aha, King Trashanku thinks, I'm going to go and ask this guy. So he sends someone to ask Vishvamitra if he'll help the king ascend. And Vishvamitra was in his meditation, but he could still hear the messenger. And he responded, not at all. He wasn't going to take this earthly bait, right? Until the messenger said, Vishista tried it, and he couldn't make it happen. So now Vishvamitra is like, that guy, that freaking guy. He's in every story. I'm always up against this guy. If I did this public act of helping King Trashanku ascend, I will be known as being just as great and powerful as Vishista. So he travels to the court. People hear about this. There's this huge fire ceremony. Like everybody in the kingdom's there. People have come from other kingdoms. And sure enough, Vishista can use his spiritual power to help King Trashanku ascend. And he's getting into the heavens, right? He's almost up to the place where people can't come anymore when Indra figures out that this is happening. This can't happen. It is against divine law. So Indra starts to press the king down. And Vishvamitra is about to lose face, right? King Trashanku is now pummeling down towards earth, and he's certainly going to die in his earthly form there. So he once again uses his spiritual power to prevent him from going all the way down to the earth. And so there, King Trashanku is caught. He's caught between heaven and earth, and everybody's watching, and it's like this spiritual standoff. At which point, Brahma has compassion and turns him into a little celestial sign, which is still in the, it's a little constellation, and it's still marked in the skies today. That's supposed to be King Trashanku, where he's been turned into a constellation instead of hovering just above the earth.
Wow, what an amazing story.
I'm not even done.
Keep going.
Okay, sweet. So anyway, instead of celebrating his like half victory, Vishvamitra is dismayed because he's fallen trapped now to the ego and to the outward attention. So he goes into a sadhana again, and this time he really sticks to it, and he becomes so adept that Lord Brahma, the creator, wants to honor him and make him a Maharishi. And he does. He makes him a Maharishi. But he says, Vishvamitra, you could become Brahma Rishi. You could become one of the most knowledgeable men the world has ever seen, if only you would go to Vishista and bow at his feet and ask for your blessing. At which time, all those years of denying his envy and his anger come up again. And he's like, that guy. It's always that guy. It's always that Vishista guy. He's always stealing my honor and my power. I have to go to bow to this guy? Oh, I'll go to him, all right. So he goes back. He travels back to the cave. And he's right next to the cave. And Vishista actually has a wife, and his wife shares his knowledge and his spiritual balance. And they're talking inside the cave. And she says, are you really going to honor this guy? And Vishvamitra's listening. He's like, what guy? What? Is it me? What? And Lord Vishista says, absolutely. Brahma himself has honored him, and I have sent him every challenge. Indra has sent him the challenge of lust. I have sent him the challenge of greed. I have challenged his ego. I have challenged his pride. And he's always returned to seek true spiritual knowledge. Of course, I will honor him. And there's Vishvamitra, listening to this, outside the cave, holding a rock which he had intended to kill his teacher with. And suddenly he's overcome. He's overcome with gratefulness and compassion, but that's not the first thing that shows up. Instead, he is overcome with self-loathing. With self-loathing, he becomes the martyr. He's overcome with guilt and shame. And he takes that rock and he starts hitting himself with it. He starts killing himself with a rock. And Vishista and his wife hear this, and they come out of the cave. And finally, they take that rock from him. Vishista takes that rock from him. And it's only then that Vishvamitra can be overcome with compassion and humility and gratefulness and honor and bow at the feet of his teacher. And that is the moment he was given the mantra. But in this old story, this fantastical, mystical story of one of the greatest teachers and one of the greatest students, I think there lies a teaching that's at the heart of everything we do. Whether you are a new teacher that's just come out of your 200-hour training, or whether you've been studying for 20, 30 years, we always arrive at this deep lesson, this deep challenge. And I think the challenge to overcome self-hatred and self-loathing is not just the last lesson, but it is also the first. Because if Vishvamitra had really loved himself, why would he need to challenge spiritual authority? If he had really felt comfortable in who he was, why would he need the power? Why would he need the accolades of others? Why would he need lust and the care of someone who was not his true spiritual partner? Why would he need the public accolades? My feeling is, in my long life as a student, and my long life of teaching Westerners, that many of us are in this trap. Whether our challenge is health, or whether our challenge is whether or not we can do a crow pose. There comes in this aspect of good person, bad person, a victim or martyr, where we pick up the rock. We have a crazy couple of weeks where we slide off from our yoga practice. Who knows? Maybe we party too much or we eat too much, whatever our shtick is. And we pick up the rock. I think that prema, which is translated as divine love, but is given as a technique in the mantras, in the sound therapy, as a way of identifying with divine love, right? The classic mantra here is aham prema, I am divine love. I think that prema is in that act of taking away the rock, of taking away that rock for our students and saying, I understand you're goal-oriented, but you're not your goals. I understand you're sick, but you're not your sickness. And I understand you're sad, but you are not your sadness. You're something far greater than that. You're a part of the whole. And the act of healing is returning to that wholeness, both as teachers and as students.
Wow. Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful story, Dana. Thank you so much for sharing that. And the teaching that comes out of that, I think, is really powerful and such an excellent note to end on. So, lastly, I always ask this. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share what you're working on. I mentioned a little bit in your bio at the beginning, but things that are coming up for you. You mentioned Prema. Prema is the name of your Prema Yoga Therapeutics. That's your company or your training program, your training organization. So if you want to tell us a little bit about what you have coming up in terms of trainings or workshops or anything else, and then share your website and all other ways people can get in touch with you.
Yeah, sure. Well, our trainings are, they're like a one-room schoolhouse. We open them up for students, also for medical professionals, and training yoga teachers as well. Just become a better teacher. So through that, we work with a Yoga Alliance a school, this great school, Pure Yoga. We teach at Pure Yoga, and then the next training will be the Ayurvedic yoga therapy training, which will be a little bit more of the esoterica, and that's all found at prema-yoga.org. Okay. I'm also leading a Ayurvedic intensive with Allison Kramer down at Yoga Vita in September, and some therapeutics at Three Sisters and at Yoga Vita coming forth in January. The Ayurvedic yoga therapy this July 13th to 31st will definitely involve that self-care, that putting down the rock, and starting a discipline that is true to your health. So I'm really excited to do that. Everything in Ayurveda is in context, right? So we'll be going to the park a lot because it's summer. Yeah. And then if you're in the Portland, Oregon area, take a look out for the Three Sisters trainings. We might have one coming up in fall, and just reach out to me. You can reach me through danaslamp.com, and there's a comprehensive training there, a list of trainings and retreats too. We're looking to go to South Africa, Jacob, in March. Yes,
awesome.
Maybe talk about transformation. To see the animals is such an amazing act. So we'll see. That might be in March. Take a look out for it.
All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much, Dana. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I think we talked about a lot of really interesting and illuminating things, and there's a lot of jewels of wisdom in there for our listeners. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Talk to you soon. Hi, everyone. Well, that was our interview with Dana Slamp. I hope you enjoyed it. To find out more about Dana and her incredible organization, Prema Yoga Therapeutics, check out Prema, prema-yoga.org. And for Dana's personal website, danaslamp.com.